Family called me burden, and disowned me, we don't want to see you. They shouted and celebrated Christmas without me. I was calm and left, but when I got my inheritance, they. In retrospect, I should have seen the Christmas ambush coming. My name is Dana Schneider. I'm 23, and for years my family had treated me like a problem they tolerated only when I was useful. They called me selfish when I kept my own paycheck and lazy because I still lived in my parents' house even though I worked full-time and helped with groceries and bills whenever I could. My older sister Claire and her husband Daniel lived there too. They paid no rent, had no jobs, and seemed perfectly comfortable letting my parents support them. Somehow, though, I was always the burden. Claire agreed with every criticism Mom made. Daniel laughed at Dad's little digs, and the four of them had built a reality where my only value was what I could hand over. A few days before Christmas, I came home from work and found all four of them waiting in the living room. No television, no casual conversation, just silence and four faces turned toward me. Mom folded her hands and said, "Dana, we need to have a serious talk." Dad delivered the verdict. "We've been thinking, and we don't want you living here anymore." Mom added that they wanted to start the new year without all this tension. Dad said I was an adult and it was wrong for me to stay under their roof while refusing to help whenever they asked. I almost laughed. I had helped. What I refused to do was surrender my salary on command. Then I looked at Claire and Daniel. Claire was trying not to smile. Daniel wouldn't meet my eyes. That was when I understood the second reason. They had been talking about having children, and my bedroom was the largest spare room upstairs. I wasn't just inconvenient anymore. I was occupying space they had already decided belonged to them. Mom kept talking about how they had given me a home for 23 years, as if parenthood had been a loan that had suddenly come due. When she finally stopped, I said, "Okay." That answer infuriated them. Mom's face tightened. "That's all you have to say?" Dad leaned forward. "We tell you we don't want to see you anymore and you don't even care?" They wanted tears. They wanted begging. Maybe they wanted me to promise them money so they could reconsider. Instead, I said, "You already made the decision. What exactly am I supposed to beg for?" Dad stood and pointed toward the stairs. "Then pack your things and leave." So I did. I filled one suitcase, grabbed my laptop, and packed whatever I could carry. No one came upstairs. No one asked if I had somewhere to go. As I walked back down, I heard Claire asking Mom whether they should eventually turn my room into a nursery. I stopped with my hand on the railing. They were planning around my absence before I had even left. That hurt more than being thrown out. It confirmed that I wasn't losing a family in that moment. I was finally seeing how little of one I had actually had. The next morning I called my Aunt Rebecca. She and my grandmother were the only relatives who had ever made me feel wanted. I barely finished explaining before Rebecca said, "Come here. Today. No lecture. No condition." When I arrived, Grandma opened the door and pulled me into a hug. That Christmas, while my parents, Claire and Daniel, celebrated without me, I sat at Rebecca's dining table with two people who kept putting food on my plate and asking if I was okay. Rebecca finally said, "You know they're terrible to you, right?" Grandma nodded. "You are not what they say you are." I wanted to believe them, but 23 years of hearing the opposite doesn't disappear overnight. For the first few weeks, I kept waiting for Rebecca to become irritated with me. I expected Grandma to hint that I was eating too much or taking up too much space. Instead, Rebecca joked that the house had been too quiet. Grandma made my favorite meals. When I offered rent, Rebecca told me to save for my future. The kindness almost made me uncomfortable, because I had been trained to believe every favor came with a hidden invoice. One evening, Grandma found me standing in the kitchen staring at nothing. She placed a hand over mine. "I should have defended you more." I told her she had nothing to apologize for. She shook her head. "I kept making excuses for your parents. They showed me who they are." Her words stayed with me. I had spent years wondering whether I could earn better treatment by giving more, apologizing faster, needing less. Grandma made me consider that maybe love wasn't supposed to be earned through submission. 3 months passed. I worked, saved money, and slowly learned what it felt like to come home without bracing myself before opening the door. Then Grandma got sick. 1 week she was cooking and teasing Rebecca. The next, she was in a hospital bed, looking smaller every time I visited. Rebecca and I stayed beside her every day. We kept telling ourselves she would come home. She never did. 2 weeks later, Grandma was gone. My parents did not attend the funeral. Claire and Daniel did not call. Not even a text. A few days later, Grandma's lawyer asked Rebecca and me to come to his office. I expected sentimental belongings, maybe jewelry or a handwritten note. Instead, the lawyer placed documents in front of me and explained that Grandma had left me her entire life savings, $500,000. I stared at the number until it stopped looking real. Rebecca squeezed my shoulder. She wanted you to have a real start. For the first time, freedom felt possible. I could get my own home, build savings, and live without hearing my parents' voices every time I spent money on myself. Rebecca warned me not to tell anyone yet. People change when they smell money, she said. She was right, because somehow my parents found out, and the first call from my mother came before I had decided what to do with a single dollar. By the time I checked my phone during lunch, I had 12 missed calls from Mom, 4 from Dad, and 3 messages from Claire. The tone changed from fake concern to outrage almost immediately. Mom wrote, "We heard about Grandma's will. Why didn't you tell us?" Dad's message was shorter. "Call me. Now." Claire somehow managed to make it sound casual. "Seriously, Dana? $500,000 and you don't tell your own family?" I stared at the screen long enough for it to dim in my hand. 3 months earlier, they had told me they didn't want to see me anymore. They had celebrated Christmas without me. They hadn't even attended Grandma's funeral. Yet, apparently $500,000 had resurrected their definition of family. Against my better judgment, I called Mom. She answered before the first ring finished. "How could you hide this from us?" she demanded. Not hello, not how are you, not a single word about Grandma. I leaned against the wall outside the break room and asked, "Hide what?" She practically shouted that I knew exactly what she meant. Then she told me that Grandma's money should never have gone entirely to me, that there were other people to consider, and that after everything my parents had done for me, I had an obligation to make things right. Dad took the phone from her. His voice was lower, but somehow worse. "You need to come home tonight. We're going to sit down as a family and decide what happens with that money." I almost smiled at the word decide. They had already decided I wasn't family when I had nothing they wanted. "No," I said. There was silence. Dad finally asked, "Excuse me," I repeated it. "No, it's my inheritance. There's nothing to decide." Mom was suddenly back on the line, screaming that they had fed me, clothed me, raised me, and let me live under their roof for 23 years. The old guilt might have worked once. This time I heard the argument differently. They weren't describing love. They were presenting an invoice for parenthood. Something inside me finally hardened. "You threw me out," I said. "You told me you wanted a life without me. You got exactly what you asked for." Mom began telling me I was twisting things, but I stopped her. "You gave me a roof because you were my parents. I spent years trying to earn affection from people who only noticed me when they needed money. We're even." Then I ended the call. I expected angry messages. What I did not expect was for them to show up at Rebecca's house the next afternoon. I heard pounding from upstairs, followed by raised voices. By the time I reached the hallway, Rebecca was already at the door. Mom, Dad, and Claire stood on the porch. Daniel apparently hadn't bothered coming. Mom looked as though she had been crying, though I couldn't tell whether the tears were real or rehearsed. "Dana," she said immediately, "please, we need you." Rebecca folded her arms. "No, you need her money." Dad ignored her and looked directly at me. He said they were struggling financially, that bills were piling up, and that Claire and Daniel were trying to prepare for a baby someday. Claire crossed her arms and added, "You have $500,000. You're acting like helping us would destroy your life." For a moment, I couldn't speak. because the hypocrisy was almost impressive. "Grandma died," I said finally. "None of you came to her funeral." Mom looked away. Dad's jaw tightened. Claire muttered that funerals were complicated and everyone was grieving differently. "But asking for her money isn't complicated?" I asked. Mom snapped that she had assumed Grandma would divide everything fairly. That word made me laugh. She did. Mom's face changed instantly. She began accusing me of turning Grandma against them. Dad said I was tearing the family apart. Claire said I was punishing everyone because my feelings had been hurt at Christmas. Rebecca let them go on for about 30 seconds before stepping forward. "You threw her out," she said quietly. "Now you're standing on my porch asking for a dead woman's money. Leave." Dad threatened that the situation was not over. Rebecca told him that if he didn't leave, she would call the police. They finally retreated to the car, but Claire stopped before getting in and looked back at me. "You're going to regret this." I remembered those words a few days later, when an email arrived from an attorney representing my parents. The message claimed that the distribution of Grandma's estate was unjust and suggested that, as her daughter and son-in-law, my parents believed they were entitled to part of it. The attorney proposed an amicable resolution, which apparently meant handing over money voluntarily so they wouldn't drag me into court. Rebecca read the email twice, then laughed without humor. "I told you they weren't finished. We initially ignored it. Grandma's will had been prepared properly, witnessed, and signed years before she became ill. There was nothing accidental about what she had done." Another message arrived several days later. This one threatening formal legal action if I refused to negotiate. I replied only once, telling their attorney that the inheritance had been distributed according to a valid will and that future harassment would be documented. I thought that might end the performance. Instead, I was served with actual court papers. My parents were suing me. The daughter they had thrown out before Christmas was suddenly worth hiring a lawyer to pursue. I panicked more than I wanted to admit. I had never been involved in a lawsuit. $500,000 sounded enormous to me, but it also suddenly felt fragile, like something that could disappear because another person signed the right document. Rebecca refused to let me spiral. She contacted an attorney she trusted, a woman named Margaret Shaw, who specialized in estate disputes. Margaret read the complaint and looked almost bored. My parents were claiming that Grandma had lacked the mental capacity to understand what she was signing, and that Rebecca and I had manipulated her into excluding them. There was one major problem with that theory. Grandma had written the will years earlier, when she was healthy, independent, and fully capable of handling her own affairs. The first hearing was brutal emotionally, but legally it went badly for my parents almost immediately. Their lawyer tried to portray Grandma as a confused elderly woman under our influence. Margaret produced medical records, dated correspondence, witness statements, and the attorney's own notes from when Grandma created the will. Everything showed that she knew exactly what she owned and exactly who she wanted to receive it. Then my parents' attorney shifted tactics. He argued that Dad was Grandma's son and therefore deserved consideration simply because of that relationship. The judge interrupted him and made something painfully simple clear. Being someone's child did not automatically entitle that person to inherit when a valid will said otherwise. I thought that would be the end of it. Then Margaret opened a folder I had never seen. She leaned toward me and whispered, "Your grandmother planned for this." Inside was a letter Grandma had instructed her attorney to preserve with the estate documents. It was addressed to my parents. I felt my stomach twist as the judge began reading it. Grandma wrote that if they were hearing those words, then they had probably chosen to fight over property she had intentionally denied them. She described watching them treat me as useful when I gave and worthless when I resisted. She wrote about the constant pressure, the belittling, and finally the decision to throw me out shortly before Christmas. She said she had spent too many years excusing their behavior because they were family, and that she regretted not protecting me sooner. The courtroom became so quiet I could hear Dad shifting in his chair. Grandma's letter went on to explain that the money had not been left to me because I was favored, or because anyone had manipulated her. She had chosen me because, in her words, I had remained compassionate even while being treated cruelly. She wanted the inheritance to give me the independence my family had repeatedly tried to take away. Her final message to them was simple. Actions had consequences, and this was theirs. Mom stared at the table. Dad's face was rigid. Claire, who had come to support them, suddenly seemed fascinated by the floor. Their case was dismissed. Completely. Outside the courtroom, Dad tried to approach me, but Margaret stepped between us. Mom began crying and saying Grandma had poisoned me against them. That almost made me stop. Instead, I looked at her and said, Grandma didn't have to poison anything. She just paid attention. Rebecca and I walked away while my parents stood there with their lawyer and whatever legal bills they had created trying to steal something that had never belonged to them. For several days, there was silence. I actually started believing the court defeat had finally exhausted them. Then my manager called me into his office. He looked uncomfortable, which immediately put me on edge. Dana, he said, HR has received some serious allegations about you. My stomach dropped. Anonymous complaints claimed that I had committed financial fraud, manipulated an elderly relative, and obtained money through deception. The accusations sounded almost identical to the arguments my parents had just lost in court. My manager told me he didn't personally believe them, but company policy required an investigation. I walked back to my desk numb. Losing the inheritance had been one thing. This was different. My job was mine. My career was something I had built without them. Yet because they couldn't take Grandma's money through guilt or through a courtroom, they were now trying to make sure I couldn't earn my own. That was the moment I understood. There would never be a natural ending with people like them. They would keep pushing until either I surrendered or I made it impossible for them to reach me again. And for the first time since Christmas, I stopped wondering whether I was being too harsh. I started wondering how far I was willing to go to make sure they never touched my life again. The HR investigation lasted almost a week, and those 7 days felt longer than the entire lawsuit. My manager kept assuring me that nobody had found evidence supporting the accusations, but every morning I walked into the office wondering who had heard the rumors and what they thought when they looked at me. I handed HR copies of the court documents, Grandma's will, and the judge's dismissal. Once they saw that the exact accusations in the anonymous complaints had already been examined and rejected in court, the pattern became obvious. By Friday afternoon, HR officially closed the investigation. My manager called me into his office and said, "Your position is safe, Dana. There's nothing here." I thanked him, walked back to my car, and sat behind the Stadinog wheel without starting the engine. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I was furious. My parents had thrown me out, demanded my inheritance, sued me when I refused, and then tried to damage the one part of my life they had never built for me. They weren't trying to reconnect anymore. They were trying to punish me for escaping. That evening, I told Rebecca everything. She listened quietly while I paced her kitchen, repeating that I didn't understand what they expected to accomplish. Rebecca finally stopped me. "You're still asking the wrong question," she said. "You keep wondering what would make reasonable people stop. They're not behaving reasonably. They stop when there are consequences." I knew she was right. Ignoring them had failed. Talking had failed. Court had failed to teach them anything. So instead of threatening them back, or giving them another dramatic confrontation, I spoke with Margaret about every legal option available to me. We documented the calls, the messages, the lawsuit, the visit to Rebecca's house, and the false workplace reports. Margaret prepared a formal cease and desist notice, warning that further harassment, interference with my employment, or attempts to contact me through third parties would be documented for possible legal action. I also stopped giving them opportunities to reach me. I changed my number, locked down my social media, removed relatives I didn't trust, and told my employer that any future complaints connected to my family should immediately be routed through HR. Rebecca installed cameras around the house after Dad's earlier visit. None of it felt dramatic. That was the strange part. I had imagined that finally cutting them off would involve shouting or some grand speech where I explained everything they had done to me. Instead, Freedom looked like paperwork, blocked numbers, passwords, and silence. Margaret had the notice formally delivered to my parents. Claire received one as well, after we learned she had been repeating their accusations to extended relatives. The message was simple: contact me again for the purpose of harassment, interfere with my job, or spread knowingly false allegations. And there would be consequences through the legal system. After that, everything stopped. No furious calls, no emails from Dad, no messages from Claire demanding that I act like a sister. For the first few days, I kept checking my phone almost compulsively, expecting something to appear. Nothing did. A week became 2, then a month. Eventually, I realized I had gone an entire day without thinking about them. That realization hit me harder than winning in court. For most of my life, my parents had occupied space in my mind, even when they weren't physically around. I had measured purchases against what Mom would call wasteful. I had second-guessed career decisions because Dad might think I was selfish. I had automatically calculated how much of every paycheck I could give away without hurting myself. Now, there was only quiet. With the legal fight finally behind me, I started making careful decisions about Grandma's inheritance. I didn't suddenly buy luxury cars or quit my job. Grandma had given me a chance to build security, and I wanted to respect that. I met with a financial advisor, kept most of the money protected, and used only what I needed to establish myself. I rented my own apartment first. Something small, but completely mine. On the first night there, I sat on the floor eating takeout because I hadn't bought a dining table yet. There were boxes everywhere and practically no furniture, but I remember looking around and thinking, nobody here can tell me to leave. I had never realized how powerful that sentence could feel. Then I did something for Rebecca. She had never asked me for money. In fact, whenever I mentioned helping her, she immediately refused. That was exactly why I wanted to do it. She had opened her door when my parents closed theirs. She had stood beside me at Grandma's funeral, beside me when the inheritance arrived, and beside me through the lawsuit. After working everything out with the bank, I paid off the remaining balance on her mortgage. When I told her, she stared at me like I had announced I was moving to another planet. Dana, absolutely not. I laughed and told her it was already done. She started crying, which immediately made me cry too. You didn't owe me anything, she whispered. I know, I said. That's why I wanted to. Life became almost boring after that, and boring turned out to be wonderful. I found a better position with higher pay and more room to grow. I furnished my apartment slowly. Rebecca came over for dinner every Sunday. Sometimes we talked about Grandma. Sometimes we talked about absolutely nothing important. I began understanding something Grandma had tried to teach me before she died. Family wasn't defined by who could claim you when there was money involved. It was defined by who stayed when there was nothing to gain. Rebecca had given me a room when I had one suitcase. My parents had rediscovered my phone number only when that suitcase came with $500,000. 6 months passed before Mom tested the silence. Her message came from a number I didn't recognize. Dana, we miss you. Enough time has passed. Can we please talk? I read it twice. No apology. No mention of throwing me out. No mention of suing me. No mention of trying to jeopardize my job. Just enough time has passed, as if time had somehow performed the apology for her. I deleted the message and blocked the number. 2 days later, Dad sent an email. His wording was almost formal. Your mother and I would like the opportunity to reconnect and put these unfortunate events behind us. Unfortunate events. That was what he called months of deliberate choices. I deleted that too. Claire was the last one to try. Her message was shorter. We're sisters. Family is family. Can't we just move past this? I stared at those words and remembered her expression the night they told me to leave. I remembered overhearing her planning a nursery in my bedroom before I had even reached the front door. I remembered her standing on Rebecca's porch telling me that keeping Grandma's inheritance was selfish. I remembered seeing her in court while our parents accused me of manipulating the woman whose funeral none of them had attended. And finally, I remembered how many years I had spent believing that sharing blood meant I had to tolerate anything they did. I typed a response, deleted it, typed another, and deleted that too. There was nothing left to explain. They already knew what they had done. What they wanted wasn't forgiveness. They wanted freedom from consequences. So I blocked Claire without replying. That was my answer. People sometimes imagine revenge as watching someone lose everything. That wasn't what happened here. My parents still had their house. Claire and Daniel still had each other. Whatever financial problems they had were theirs to solve. I didn't destroy their lives, and eventually I stopped caring whether they regretted losing access to mine. The real victory was much quieter. I stopped feeling guilty when my phone didn't ring. I stopped rehearsing arguments with them in my head. I stopped wondering whether being a better daughter could have made them better parents. Grandma's inheritance gave me financial independence, but the greatest thing she left me wasn't $500,000. It was proof that someone had seen what was happening to me and believed I deserved better. Sometimes I still think about that Christmas. Mom telling me they wanted to begin the new year without me. Dad denag me to pack. Claire waiting for my bedroom. At the time, walking out of that house felt like the worst rejection of my life. Now I understand it differently. They thought they were removing a burden. What they actually did was remove the last reason I had to keep carrying them. They celebrated when I left because they believed I had nothing. Months later, when they discovered Grandma had given me the future they could no longer control, suddenly they wanted their daughter back. But by then, it was too late. They asked for a life without me. I simply stopped standing in their way.